Thank you again to everyone for joining us today for part 2 of the Empowering Atlantic Settlement and Integration Sector SPOs for Anti-Racism Action Planning series that IRCC is hosting in partnership with Ivan Okello from Ocan Consultants. Ivan will be taking questions after the small group discussions and at the end of the presentation. You can also use the chat to post your questions at any point. The IRCC team will monitor the chat to ensure questions are answered. The slide decks will be shared next week, along with the recordings. You can also expect an event survey from us by the end of the day. Now I'd like to welcome our speaker for this series, Ivan Okello. Ivan, thank you for joining us today, and over to you.
Well, thank you so much. And I'd just like to begin by welcoming all of you to our session today. I know that all of you have put so much effort into participating in this session. And I would just like to mention I have like a friend's child, with us today. So you might be hearing in the background of a little young man who is unhappy and wanting his lunch. And we just decided to go into care duty to help a friend to be able to go and do some, like activities. But again, welcome everyone. We are happy you could join us. So for those of you that joined us last week, obviously, like we were able to get like a quick introduction into anti-racism work. And today we're going to do something kind of slightly different, which is to go a little bit deeper to get a sense of how does this work make sense within the organization, but also how do we create, like a strategy that can make this work more intentional, more inclusive, and more participatory. So for those of you that joined us last week, we really went on to explore the foundations of anti-racism. We went through some of the key terms and other elements. And today we're really going to focus on the action planning. And because this work is important, we want to acknowledge, that doing it well is as important as doing it right. So we want to just really acknowledge and emphasize that this is always a growing body of work. So depending on your knowledge and experience, there's opportunities for us to grow and improve and continue to do this work in a meaningful way. So my intention this afternoon is to really walk you through this session for about 25 minutes. Then we'll transition into groups. We'll set you up in groups just to make sure you're able to participate in a meaningful way. And the idea is just to make sure that you get to really learn from the expertise within the group, because you know that you will bring, a wide range of lived experience, and it's critical that we build upon that and we use it to really expand this work. So with that in mind, I'm going to begin with the land acknowledgement, and this is really to set the tone for our discussion today, and I know that we'll get to walk through this session a little bit more, but really, really importantly, I would like to acknowledge that we conduct this work in the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqey, and Passamaquoddy peoples, and we are treaty people, and that is whether you are an early settler to Canada or a recent newcomer. We all have an obligation to establish ongoing relations with Indigenous communities, because this work is essential in being able to create, like an inclusive culture, but also to be able to really collaborate towards reconciliation. And I know that there's been so much work within the last 10, 15 years towards reconciliation, and anti-racism work is a key component of reconciliation work. So with that in mind, I would also like to disclose that I do not have any conflicts of interest to disclose throughout this session. And this is something that I've done for the recent number of years. And it's just a product of my growth, but also my product of appreciation of the value of anti-racism work in creating stronger communities, in creating resilient communities. And I want us to really emphasize this as a growing body of work. So you might find out that some of the things you hear today are familiar, some of the things you hear are new, but all of this is completely fine. We're constantly growing and we're constantly doing better. And when you know more, you act better. So with that, welcome, and we'll get started with our session. So first things first, I would like to walk us through a recap. Last week, we really went through some key definitions of anti-racism. We looked at what is racism, and we really explored it as the application of discriminatory beliefs. So if I have a discriminatory belief and I act on it, that is discrimination or racial discrimination, because I'm applying a belief system that has a real negative impact on people, and we want to be able to address that. We also looked at the anti-racism organizational maturity model, and this was the idea that organizations are transitioning really from a very compliant stage, which means they're doing the minimum to comply with government regulations, whether it is the Canadian Human Rights Act, the New Brunswick Human Rights Act, the Nova Scotia Human Rights Act, but that organizations have this opportunity to grow into becoming inclusive organizations or becoming anti-racist organizations. And lastly, we explored anti-racism positionality. And this is the idea that you cannot do anti-racism work without reflecting on your position within anti-racism. So whether it is you being a person of privilege or you being a person that has different intersecting identities that affect how you engage with different systems. So this was really kind of to give you an introduction into this work. But today, we're really going to walk ahead and really explore what are the frameworks around anti-racism work. What have you seen in the last 10, 15 years regarding anti-racism work? What are these principles that are essential for us to embrace when we're doing this work? And what are some of the ways we could design and implement an anti-racism action plan and make sure that it speaks to the needs of the community, it aligns with the strategy of the organization, but it also creates a real impact within the community. Because as I said last week, if this work does not transform people's lives, we have not delivered. And lastly, we'll explore how to evaluate, because evaluation is critical to making sure that we achieve the right results, but also we meet the expectations that we set at the beginning. So with that, I would like us to really walk through a little bit about Canada's anti-racism strategy. Now, many of you will know from several years ago that human rights work was really focused on addressing the different forms of racism and sexism and discrimination, but it was driven largely by Human Rights Commission. So in New Brunswick, we have the New Brunswick Human Rights Commission. In Nova Scotia, you have the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission. We have the Canadian Human Rights Commission. And these were basically the engine agencies that were driving, anti-discrimination work. But more and more, there's been a growing recognition that this work is important. So we need direct government leadership on it. And we've seen the federal government create an anti-racism strategy. And now I think we have the second strategy from 2024 to 2028. We've seen provinces create direct efforts to address racism. I think Nova Scotia has an anti-racism act. And this really demonstrates that governments are starting to really understand the complexity of racism as a problem, but also to be able to address it. And the primary kind of ideologies around the strategies have been to really focus on systemic racism as a system. Now, for many of us that work in settlement and immigration, it's been to really look at how does the immigration system work and what are the manifestations of racism within that system. And we've seen several examples, whether it is in the application process or in the scoring system or in the access to services, post-migration, or in the integration of the different individuals into Canadian society upon arrival. But also we've seen this understanding that there is experiences of discrimination and racism within settlement and integration. And we saw New Brunswick, for instance, have a survey in 2022 looking at what are the experiences of different community members in terms of interaction with systems. And this is really where we saw the idea of systemic racism emerging. And this was really the growing recognition that while we interact with systems, whether as newcomers, whether individuals with intersecting identities, there are going to be moments where those systems will not look at us from a place of fairness. And this is really where the idea of really being able to re-examine and understand how does settlement and integration work and how does it sometimes enable systems that cause harm to these different communities. And then the other aspect was looking at systemic bias and to really understand how might that affect different people, especially in the settlement and integration journey. So really, it gives you the sense that now there's a growing recognition within government, but also in different departments within government. And we see, for instance, for the folks in this room that that Citizenship, Refugees and Immigration Canada has become more and more involved in understanding the manifestations of racism and systemic discrimination within the settlement and integration field. And this wasn't really the case 10 years ago, and it wasn't really the case 40 years ago, because the landscape was so different, the migrant communities were so different, and the needs of those communities interacting with these communities were so different. So we really start to see that there's a growing intention to really address this kind of like emerging needs from a more systemic kind of way, and to make sure that it's responsive. So this is really where we start to see that funding can actually be allocated to this work with the intention of addressing it in a strategic and meaningful way. So we also want us to really explore what are some of the principles of this work. Now, this is really where it starts to get crucial, because these principles guide the fundamentals of how this work is done. And one of the things I want us to really focus on is the idea that this is intersectional work. Like, you cannot do anti-racism work within certain, exclusivities. You have to look at the multidimensional ways that different individuals are impacted by different systems. And we've seen this manifest, whether it is newcomer men that are accessing settlement services to find meaningful employment, and what those experiences might look like compared to non-status women that might be experiencing, significant barriers in their access to employment support or integration services. And you really start to see that to do this work in a meaningful way means that we have to really look at it from an intersectional approach. And that requires a combination of different systems. Sometimes it's communications, and we've seen the communications in how we engage with different ethnic communities. It requires transparency in sometimes how the systems perform, but also it requires a systems approach. And this is really the idea that this is not a single line problem. This is a systemic problem that can have real implications. And if you intervene from a single intervention, it may not really have the impact that you want in being able to create a systemic and inclusive kind of environment. So these are some of the examples that you really start to see that this work is essential, but also you want to make sure that it addresses the needs within the communities, because if it doesn't address the need, you really miss the mark. And this is where I want us to really focus on and look at this work as meaningful and transforming in a meaningful way. Now, something I would like to raise with all of you is that, so what is your role in this work? Like, what is your participation in this work, and how would that be? And, I'm just going to pause. Well, sorry about that. So one thing I was bringing back was to really reemphasize that in doing this work, it's important to really reflect on our roles. And for us that work in settlement and integration, one of the key elements in doing this work is to be able to really engage in it, but thinking about how do we contribute in a meaningful way. And one example is to really be able to examine, how do we integrate anti-racism work into our daily operations? Now, for us that work in this work, we know that we run programs, we do events, we engage with different stakeholders, we provide direct services. In some instances, we provide indirect services. And it's really crucial to reflect on how do these services serve different community members, because depending on the operation of the services, you may reveal some inequities or some processes that actually impact the accessibility of the services within community. And this is really where the concept of culturally relevant services comes to play, because we know that Canada has become one of the most multicultural and diverse countries on the planet. And with that comes a really strong demand that our services are culturally responsive, but also the culturally relevant. And I've seen this, an example I can reference has been how, settlement organizations engage with Indigenous communities. And depending on where you stay, depending on the places you've lived in, you really start to see that, like Indigenous communities have a different relationship to settlement agencies, because for some, there's been a strong kind of relationship to educate newcomers and new Canadians about their place in Canadian society and the history of Canada as a society. But in some instances, there's been no relationship whatsoever, and newcomers have really had little to no opportunity to understand how to engage with indigenous communities, how to be responsive to indigenous needs, whether it is around indigenous sovereignty, indigenous resource ownership, indigenous inclusion to aspects of Canadian society. So, and settlement organizations play a crucial and also bridging role in enabling these conditions. And this is really where you start to see that there can be a real impact in the communities. Now, the other aspect is being able to really address systemic racism within your organizations. Now, this is again another aspect whereby within the strategy that there's been a growing recognition that there's been the systems that operate almost like silently, but have a real impact on the communities themselves, but also on the livelihoods of people. And we can see employment, for instance, being a real example where there's been examples where individuals don't get the same access to employment, they don't get the same access to really being given a fair chance to be able to succeed. And this is really where organizations have a unique role in being able to really explain or sometimes be able to really engage with our communities that are affected by racism and provide them first-hand support. And I've had actual interactions with newcomers where they're looking for employment, they're struggling to find employment, and they're really looking to understand, is it my skills? Is it my language? Is it like my ways of communication? And, and I think these are moments where sometimes it's one thing to be able to provide supports to address those things, but it's also another thing to sort of say, if someone has, a racial harassment incident, does the organization have the means and the tools to support that individual to find justice, to find restoration, or sometimes to restore dignity to the person? And this is really where you see that settlement organizations and have a really central role in being able to be the bridge between the experiences of newcomers and refugees and Canadians, and and systems that these individuals are going to interact with from an ongoing place. And this is really why it's crucial to be able to see, how do we navigate this work and how do we make sure that it creates a lasting change? So with that in mind, I would like us to really go ahead and explore and say, now that we know that there is a Canadian anti-racism strategy by the federal government, now that we know that IRCC has prioritized anti-racism work to be able to be a priority in the delivery of services, how do we go about designing an anti-racism action plan? And one of the things I want to leave with you is that fundamentally, you would need to do at least 4 things to have the groundwork established for you to proceed with your anti-racism action plan. Now, the first one would be organizing, establishing an organizational assessment. And this is really an opportunity for you to assess what is the capacity of your organization to pursue anti-racism work from a place of competence, from a place of understanding, but also from a place of responding to community need. Now, the other aspect is saying, how do we engage with relevant communities? Now, we've seen this, for instance, whether it is conducting a consultation exercise with the newcomer community, or it's able to engage with, multicultural, communities and understanding what are their experiences when it comes to accessing settlement and integration services. Is it from a place of knowledge? Is it a place of understanding? Or are there some invisible barriers that we do not see, but these communities constantly interact with, that limit the level of access and knowledge of what services they could be able to find? Or sometimes it's actually the idea that these, ethnocultural communities do not really know how to access government to be able to advocate on behalf of their communities for some of these things. And this is really where it's supposed to really explore the level of trust that an organization has to reach community and say, this is what we think is important, and we're looking to find clarification to say, what do we do to address this need? Or do we even think this is the real need? And I've seen this happen in many instances, for instance, when we reach out to communities talking about, a lack of housing for newcomer communities or homelessness within the newcomer communities. And you really start to see that the understanding of newcomers of what's going on is somewhat different from the understanding of settlement agencies in terms of what is going on. And this is really where, when it comes to whether it is individuals with families not able to find housing because, the landlords are expecting, that there is a no-child policy, or there's no pets allowed, or you should have only a certain number of, family members to be able to, access a community. And this is really where you get feedback like that really speaks to the real lived experiences of those communities. And the other part is really being able to say, now that we've been informed by this knowledge from the community, how do we move ahead and create, a roadmap for being able to implement some of these actions? And sometimes that roadmap means you did not find all the answers. You need to speak to specific people to get further clarity, to understand on what the problem is. Or some other instances, it's like, this has been advocated for, for 5 to 10 years with little to no action. Now we need to find a new way of engaging with government and other stakeholders to intervene in a meaningful way. So these are some of the key considerations. And when you're creating an anti-racism strategy, this is fundamentally where your your consultation with community has given you feedback. You've decided to establish a plan on what you're going to do. And the strategy is really, how does this succeed? And I've seen many organizations actually do an assessment, they do community engagement, they create an action plan, but they do not have a strategy, which means they do not have a winning strategy to say, how does this actually get accomplished? And in the last 5 to 7 years, I've seen more organizations fail on the strategy end because they consulted community, they got feedback, they created an action plan, but it wasn't clear how this would be achieved and whether that is, like a collaboration with other agencies, whether it was a partnership with the funder or other things. So it really tells you that sometimes planning to do anti-racism work versus delivering and accomplishing to do anti-racism work can be really challenging because there is a complex set of needs. There's a long consultative process. Sometimes there's a varying set of needs within those communities, and it's crucial for us to be able to reflect and address those where they emerge. So now that you've kind of gone through the whole plan on how to create, like an action plan, how does one go ahead with the different steps? So the first one I generally recommend is to do an assessment. Who is the initiator of that assessment? And sometimes I've seen when boards are saying, we think it's a new direction for organization to pursue this work. So we want this to happen. And that becomes something led to the leadership of the organization. In other instances, we've seen, for instance, the senior leadership say, we've had so many newcomers move to Halifax. We need a new strategy to engage with different stakeholders to really be able to respond to those communities and make sure, whether it is international students, whether it is newcomers, whether it is, like refugee communities. And we saw this, with the Syrian refugee, arrivals. We saw this like with Ukraine, where organizations need to pivot to respond to these specific needs. But sometimes there's also a need to shift the mission of the organization. And sometimes it's like, our organization was founded 40 years ago, and our mission was to help newcomers, on arrival. And now you find that Canada receives as big a population of international students and refugees, and perhaps there's a need to shift that kind of direction. Or sometimes it's the programs whereby the organization provides exclusive programs to communities. So whether it is newcomer communities or refugee communities or international students. And this is again where it's important to reflect, does the organization have the alignment or the strategy to pivot and respond to those needs in real time? And it really tells you that doing this assessment is actually one of the first steps, because it tells you fundamentally 3 things. One, how equipped is the organization to do this work now? How could the organization be equipped to do this work later? Which means if you are able to make some pivots and changes, you could be well prepared. Or sometimes, are we even prepared to do this work ever? And you could find that, for instance, one organization might be more focused on refugees, and it will say, you know what, our mandate and mission has been on supporting displaced communities who are, seeking refuge in Canada, and we want to stick to that mission, and we will stick to that mission and accomplish that in different ways. And then there's the question of resources. And, whether it's time, whether it is human resources, or whether it's financial resources. And all of us in this sector know that this is the hardest part of doing our jobs, because we are constantly doing miracles with limited, resources. So it can be incredibly challenging. And I think it's essential to reflect on these pieces and use them as kind of guideposts of saying, is this the time to do this work? But also, if we do this work, which one is realistic to achieve within 12 months, within 2 years, within 5 years? Because in some other instances, you might find out that we cannot do this work because we are so limited, or we are doing so many other things that we don't have the capacity to deliver this work and to do it in a meaningful way. So it's essential that this work really happens. And we've seen other instances where we hold community conversations and we engage with local partners, whether it's municipalities or villages or other nonprofit organizations, to gather feedback. And I find that's a fantastic step, because it always tells you really the pulse of the community to say, what is the most important thing? And the interesting thing for me is that I saw maybe 5-6 years ago, when the focus was more like, we need to grow our economy, we need to make sure we have, like, we retain people within our communities and all of that. While the real need was actually that housing was going to be one of the bigger pressures within our communities. But some of the people indicated at the time that we need to make sure that we have enough room and board for everybody that chooses this city as their home. And now we are seeing, a real kind of difficulty around that, whereby most of our cities don't have enough, placements to accommodate our peoples, or some other times there's not a lot of space, but if people seek and come to the organization, there's not a lot the organization can do. And that's because systemically, there's not a lot of options that the organization can pursue to redress these sorts of interactions. So it tells you that sometimes between doing an organizational assessment and doing an assessment within, the community, you might hear very different things. And sometimes you need to read between the lines to say, what does it say about how prepared we are to pursue this work? Because if you pursue the work and it's not completed, the loss is on the community, because they're the ones that we're counting on the organization to do this work. So with that in mind, I would like us to kind of go ahead and say, so now that we know how to explore this process of creating an anti-racism action plan, how do we go about creating one? And there are 5 areas that I've suggested that we will explore, and we're going to put you in breakout groups, in a moment. And I want you to really think about them fundamentally from 3 or 5 focus areas. One of them is equitable workplaces. And we know that every organization is looking to hire the best talent, keep the best talent, and be able to retain that talent in the long run, and create a culture that is thriving and is good for the well-being of everybody. But that's always not the case, because it's challenging work. Some other times it's actually in the delivery of our programs. So again, that might be an area where the programs we design or the services we deliver need to be designed in a way that responds to complex needs of different communities. For instance, I've seen in Moncton where there's organizations that provide supports to families that are displaced due to domestic violence, or family separation. And we know that's really, really complex work, like designing programs for whether it's like newcomer families or refugee families or women in general that experience domestic violence. That's challenging work. So for you to think about an anti-oppressive approach that removes barriers for these communities could be a priority for your organization. In other instances, it's policy and developing policy within your organization, or adapting policy. So again, and these are really the core elements that are essential within organizations to make sure that they're inclusive, they're purposeful, and they respond to real needs within our community. And the other one would be human resources. We know that we all need talent to run organizations. And the last one is accountability. You might decide you want to do all these things, but the leadership does not have ownership and an intent to really apply that. And that's the thing that it leads us to ask, how do we really pursue this work and make sure that it responds to real needs? And the thing that I want us to explore is to really use one case study. So we're going to use one example, and let's say we're going to create an action plan for a new agency. Now, some of you may have seen organizations created around Atlantic Canada, and we're going to call it the Atlantic Newcomer Center. And I want us to think of creating an action plan within 12 months that is going to respond to these needs. And the consultation starts today. And all of us within this group would be really, key architects of making that happen. And one of the things I want us to focus on is to really think what should be the priorities as a start, but more importantly, what should be the key actions that should be done, and if those actions are to be done, who should be doing them? So is it yourself? Is it the managers? Is it the staff? Is it the interns? And I want you to indicate as clearly as possible on who actually gets to do this work. And because that's also important, because if no one is assigned to do the work, more likely than not, that work will not get done. And I want us to really explore, and we're going to do a breakout activity, in a moment. And the fundamental thing I want us to explore is I want us to identify one domain that we want to pursue. So it could be human resources. If we're in HR, it could be, it could be program development. If we develop programs, it could be senior leadership and accountability. If we're a senior leader. And one of the things we're going to do is we're going to create breakout rooms with the support of the RACER team. And I want you to discuss within your group, what are the 3 recommendations that fit that domain that you're looking to get? And the reason I emphasize on 3 to 5 is that I want you to get to the best recommendations. Because we all know that if, let's say, I pick 5 recommendations, most people, if they're honest, they will do 3. Some people might not even have time to do 2. So I want us to really reflect and say, which are the ones that speak to us? How are we going to pursue them? Who is going to lead this work? Who is going to support this work? How will we know that we've succeeded? Is it, let's say, for program development, we had 50 people come to our programs and finish it over 6 weeks? Or is it 50 people saying, you know what, this is such a transformative, experience, and I'm so grateful that I have so much opportunity to pursue based on participating in that program. What timeline would it take to achieve that? It could be 12 months, like I suggested. It could be longer. And what are the expected results? Like, what do we think right now would be an indicator of success to say, oh, we aimed for 50 people, 50 people arrived and took our program. 50 of them went ahead to say they benefited from it, and it gave them incredible opportunities to pursue, their career options somewhere else. So what I'm going to do is, so we're going to spend maybe the next 25 to 30 minutes really breaking out in groups. And basically, you're going to have a sheet attached in the, in the comments, and it has fundamental questions. So I'll ask you to introduce yourselves to each other, so at least you know who else is within your group. And I want you to really explore the domains that we've discussed, whether it is equitable workplaces, program design, policy development, human resources, leadership accountability, and decide on those. And then you have a set of questions, and we'll spend maybe 25 minutes exploring those. And I want you to come back and, and share with us, what did you find was important? What do you think was a priority that you could take for your organization? What do you think was going to be a challenge, even though you wanted to pursue it? And this is an open space. I don't want it to feel like there's any wrong answers. We are here to learn. We are here to grow. And it's safe for us to express ourselves. We'll just make sure that we hold this space and be able to contain it in a way that is respectful. And I generally recommend, if you're going to share any material after this session, you can take the lesson and say, this is what I learned from the session, but so and so said it. You don't have to name the person. You don't have to recount the whole story that they shared, because I think a trust-based society is where we share lessons, and those lessons benefit every one of us. So with that in mind, I'm going to stop sharing, and then I will ask Victoria or Florence to, break out the rooms, and we'll get to do this, maybe for the next 25 minutes or so. This is always the hardest part, having to interrupt the really good conversations all of you are having. And I find whoever takes the last word for those 30 seconds before the group kind of comes to a close. I think we need to reserve special presence because they have to say what they have to say in remarkably short time. But we'll give folks just like another minute. Well, welcome everybody. I know we had aimed to give you about 30 minutes to go through that, and I know it went by so quickly. So again, if if you did not get through all the material, like do not feel awful at all, because we know that sharing time between a couple of people is not easy. And I've tried it with my friends sometimes where I'm like, you know what, let's see if each one of us can speak for a minute, for 6 minutes between the six of us. So I'm just curious to know any initial thoughts, any emerging questions. I got a chance to hop on to a couple of the groups, and some of you asked really open and complex questions. I took some down, but I also wanted to open the floor to anyone really to share, what did you learn? What surprised you? What spoke to you? But also what is something that you think is like a key question that we could address for the benefit of the group? And yeah, and we're going to go through like all like the domains that we had discussed. And I know for some groups they had a bit of a difficulty because that was crossover. And crossover is completely fine, where one kind of domain area is more connected to another as well. But any initial thoughts and initial questions, if you want to shoot your hand right up and share with the bigger group, because I find that we can, most of us are only in a small group of six, and I know that it would be great to hear what everybody else shared within their group so everybody else can benefit. So anyone, you could just shoot your hand up and the floor is yours. Oh, the first place is always the hardest. So Michelle, you've taken
Yes,
the
I figured
prize.
I'll break the ice there and I'll speak. So yeah, we had some interesting discussions, and I think we had said that we're going to talk about program design and service delivery because we were kind of a bit more all in that service, direct service part of things, not in HR or things like that. But and Philip had made a great point of like, everything needs to start, however, with an equitable workplace. So how can you design programs and service delivery? You can't start there. You need to start with an equitable workplace to model that, to know what that looks like. And so I liked that, like to start with an equitable workplace, and then you can from there create program or design programs and your service delivery to also be to model those policies.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. And I think that's a really excellent kind of overview of it, because I think really having an equitable workplace means it works well for the staff, but also it works well for the staff that are interacting with the clients. And I think from that, whether it's like policy design comes in or program design comes in, those pieces make sense. And it could be really like recommendations to be like, we will have training for new staff coming in to know how do we interact with clients of these backgrounds, how do we deal with difficult subject matter. And with the last 2 years, we've seen like the war in Ukraine, we've seen the war in Gaza, and it's like these individuals have ties to different parts of the world that are dealing with, global tensions. There's war, there's displacement, and I think this is really why it's critical to be able to have those conversations. Because in my mind, if they're not having conversations with, the case managers or settlement staff, I mean, who else would you really think they would be able to have those conversations with? So you can almost see that the pendulum is swinging more towards you as the trusted kind of folks that are able to navigate these conversations. And I think doing that in a respectful way, especially in a very polarized kind of environment that we're in, is even challenging, because I mean, and that's not talking about ICE, that's not talking about what's happening in the States with funding and all these things. So there's this very strong geopolitical factors. And because we have clients with all kinds of ties to the rest of the world, it definitely doesn't become easy. But I think being an inclusive workplace means that you're at least on the steps to enabling those conversations. Anybody else? I know that I would love to hear, just for the benefit of everyone, what your conversations were, and if there was any key learning, or even like a question. I took a question down because I was in one of the groups and it was a really complex question that I will address. But anybody?
Well, I'll jump in with my group. We decided we're like chums in the water, and we'll do it together as a group. So we talked a little bit about policies and equitable policies, and that's really where I'm just going to lay the top foundation, because a note taker did such an amazing job. So I'm more just introducing them, that they will hopefully unmute and continue with our conversation that we had.
That's me. Okay. Thank you for fitting me to the show. Great job. Yeah, we took some notes. So I'm not going to go through every single question, but just in a nutshell, we talked about, for our group, we wanted to create an equity policy. And then we later discussed that an equity policy would be good, but it's kind of hard to implement an equity policy without an action plan. So we talked about having an action plan. And we also kind of took some time to talk about the barriers that can come with that. For grassroots organizations or smaller organizations, we talked about the lack of time and resource and capacity. And then for bigger organizations, we talked about the fear of policies being kind of like a cover up or disingenuous, or even potentially used to, cover or, potentially be tokenized. We also talked about issues with timeline when it comes to these policies. A lot of people like to, make it perfect, and or fear of risk management. So if there's a mistake in the policy, they don't want to be, canceled, or, get kind of, thrown apples or tomatoes or whatever. So there is kind of a fear when it comes to releasing policies and to the public. And we also talked about, when it comes to ensuring success in our action plan, we would kind of have a section within the policy that allows for constant reviewing, maybe an annual review of the policy. And also making sure that we have, systems in place and committees in place, and we have, prominent action plans that are sustainable and long-term, so that the work isn't just, trendy, or we're just doing it because we're asked to, that it is sustainable and inclusive and, all in all equitable. So yeah, I think that's what we talked about. I don't know if anybody else from the team wants to add something. I know I kind of just did a whoosh of everything, but if anybody wants to add that, that'd be great. But that's what we talked about. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that was really comprehensive. And I think the interesting thing from listening to your group is that there's so many of these considerations that all of you revealed, whether it is what is the public perception if there's like a backlash against your policy. And I think we've seen in the last 5 years that sometimes there's a backlash because of virtually anything. You could have a backlash between, just drinking a regular pop and a diet pop. And I think it just tells you how we are in such a really challenging kind of time, but also at the same time, there is always that learning and growth perspective. And I find that's the one actually, like, whatever your organization is having difficulty to do or is unable to do, that is a growth opportunity, and it's a growth opportunity for individuals. And I think that's always a really receptive kind of way of being able to pursue that work. Because if it's more like, you're wrong, so-and-so is right, it's very much of a diminishing kind of environment. And that is not inclusive. It's not inclusive for conversation. It's not inclusive for growth. So you can almost see that in itself is problematic. And sometimes one of the challenges in our work is to challenge people that want to create that kind of reductive environment. But the points where it's almost like, oh, you're either winning or you're losing. And it's like, no, like, you're growing too, and that growth phase is as important as being able to do things well, as long as we consider that there's no harm. So that's really important. Michelle, you have your hand up, and then we'll
Yes,
try
I
and
just wanted to add, kind of piggyback on Dorcas there, and shamelessly plug the NBMC's work on the policy. So NBMC as the umbrella organization for settlement work in New Brunswick, we are currently trying to develop a template for anti-racism policies. So like Dorcas mentioned, some people are afraid to put something in place and it be wrong, and they get criticized, or they get tomatoes thrown at them. So we're really lucky to have a very talented team at NBMC, which includes Dorcas. We're quite lucky to have Dorcas working on these portfolios. So for the organizations that are on the call today who are members of NBMC, this should be finalized fairly soon and will be shared out and will be a starting tool. At least, you will have to put in some of your local information, but it will be a good starting tool for them to be able to then go and create your anti-racism policy. So we're really happy to see what the team who's working on that will have as a final product. And of course, I'm sure that NBMC would be quite happy to share that out with ERASA as well. And hopefully that will be helpful to other organizations.
Yeah, and thank you, Michelle. That's a fantastic, addition. And I find that if there's any resources within the sector, like that is something I highly recommend to be able to share, because there's also like the growing and the groaning that comes with doing this work, especially when it's hard. And if there's organizations you can learn from, please, NBMC is one of them. And I know Michelle and Dorcas quite well because we worked together for a little over 2 years. So it's actually nice that there's already, things that we can learn from and also share, because I think this is hugely impactful. John, you want to go ahead?
Yes, thanks. For our group, again, we were focused on program design and service delivery for what we were going through. And we took a very, very broad lens to what we were looking at for where we thought the improvements would come. So our recommendations that we had settled on as a team were a needs assessment of our current and our prospective clients. Like if we just open the doors, who are we looking to serve and who are we hoping to serve? And an awareness of the local supports and what our areas of our concern are in our service area. And then an awareness of our internal and external resources to be able to provide that client support. So who is our team? What skills do we have and what skills do we want? And then our key actions fell off of that relatively easily and very generally. What I'm hearing and what I'm fearful of for our group as we went through it is, did we have a strong enough anti-racist lens to these activities by keeping it as general as we did? Or does that meet the expectation that it's inclusive enough that it's considering all the impacted parties, that's where the anti-racist activities come in sometimes? We weren't sure, but some of those things that we talked about when we were assessing who the stakeholders were doing it, a lot of it came down to speaking to the people that were impacted most by it, by our clients, some of our senior staff with their diverse experiences, depending on whether or not they're new to the country and relatively new to our community, or things that they've experienced elsewhere, as well as we relied on some of our senior managers to help with that steerage for where the whole ship is trying to go. That if we're trying to go in a direction, you need that kind of true north guide and then the follow-up supports underneath it. Potential barriers, I think everybody's talked a lot about them, are language and communication. Are we even talking the right language for who our clients are in our community? Do we have those language abilities, especially for a rural provider, or do we have that interpretation or that ability to provide interpretation? Is there organizational trust? Just because we open the door and say that we're providing that service, are we a provider of choice in the community? And what do we have to do to change that with our community reputations? And the last one that we added coming on towards the end that I really loved is, do we know what success looks like? Do we have a KPI or a metric or some kind of an outcome that we can attach to speak to? We've done the work that we're putting all this effort into, or is it just a bunch of really nice sounding, well-intended activities without an outcome that leads to success? And I really like that one. For our timeline to get through all of these, we had 9 action items that we came up with, and we said even reasonably, if we're talking a month per action item, we're about a year before we're going to see those change. So just trying to be really reasonable with each of us to make sure that if we want to succeed, it's going to take time and it's going to be a struggle over different points. So put that effort in, knowing at the start that it's not going to be a quick fix and that it's not just lip service towards what's an important initiative. And then I'm going to shut up.
I mean, and that's fantastic. I think your group did an excellent job. And I think with everything you've shared, the interesting thing for me is when you reference like you had more action items and all of them, each one would take a month. And I think that really brings you back to assessing the scope of your action items to sort of say, is this something that, has to be done, has a tangible impact on the communities you're going to serve, has a realistic outcome for us to say, this is what will have known to have succeeded. And I find that actually helps because I've seen instances where you have 15 recommendations while you have only the capacity to do 6, and then 6 out of 12 feels like you've actually fallen short of the expectation while you could have actually been doing 6, and those 6 would have been such a clear demonstrative success for one to accomplish. And I think I personally recommend that if you have to go lean and deliver on that in a really tangible way, you gain so much trust, you gain so much respect, and you gain so much appreciation as a collaborator within organizations than taking 15 and then doing, a few, which again puts you in almost like a deficit kind of interpretation. So that's something to really keep in mind. But this is really insightful because it tells me that you're already reflecting on how you're going to build your tools and how you're going to apply them. And timeline is essential. Like every time you have a timeline and you say, oops, we have so much to do in a year, that is already your first indicator that you may not actually be able to accomplish all of that. And I think it's the first kind of instinct to say, should you pivot? Should you reevaluate? Should we engage with some stakeholders to streamline on that? And yeah, but really fantastic points, John. Thanks for sharing. So with that, it leaves us about 4 minutes to wrap up, which I find is always one of the blessings with time because it goes before you know it. And one of the things I just want to begin by thanking all of you for sharing, and I'll try and wrap up maybe in the next 3 or 4 minutes so we can have like a quick Q&A at the end. So one of the things I want to leave with you, and this is something for you to think about, that when you're thinking of really going through to sort of say, what am I going to prioritize as a domain, whether it is, is it my workplace? Is it policies? Is it designing my programs? Like to really think about it from a systems approach, because more often than not, this is where you really start to see what is the ripple effect of this intervention over the long term. And I find that's always like one way for you to really be able to engage with this work, because you'll start to really see that if you approach it this way in 12 months, how much can you accomplish? How do you know you have accomplished something? And a lot of times these things work together. It's like you might have a policy, it's attached to staff doing some work, to funding being able to be available for the staff to do that work, or prioritization. So it's so easy to have too many cooks in the kitchen and so little gets done, or at the very least, you have a very unpleasant meal. But I think the crucial piece I would recommend is to really identify and engage with stakeholders. Like I have lived in New Brunswick for 5 years and I've seen the work NBMC has done. I've seen the work that Prude Inc. has done in St. John. I've seen the work that Eraser, does in Halifax and Iceland. And I think there's already a network of actors there that have a really strong kind of placement within different communities, and to be able to utilize that and to be able to learn. And I think the challenging thing is often when we reflect on it to sort of say, does this respond to the root cause? And I think when you talk about, when we talk about like, whether it's like racism or like newcomers having challenges, it's like sometimes, and I've had these experiences where I talk to stakeholders, especially in government, and I'm like, is this the root cause? And the more you ask that question and the more you talk to different people, the more you start to see that sometimes they think about the root cause in so many different ways. And one intervention might speak to one stakeholder and not so much to the other. So it's really essential to kind of reflect on these things as kind of, because this is the process of doing the work, which I find can be complex, can be challenging, can have a lot of limitations. And there's so many critics also out there that will take the chance, to diminish your work by where you're falling short, which I find is accountability is important. but being able to encourage and move work forward is also equally important. And the last two things is to really emphasize on methodology. And this is more if you're going to evaluate, if you're going to monitor your work. I find I've seen instances where we do anti-racism work with no evaluation, with no clear, and I think this is the piece that helps us really demonstrate results to funders, demonstrate value to, to our partners or stakeholders, to really show that we created a policy, we shared it with, 50 organizations, and it reached 100 staff, and the staff actually told us that it helps them talk about incidences of discrimination when they do happen, and obviously focus on equity at every stage, because that's essential in everything we do. So I know like this is only a start for many of you, but one thing I hope I can leave with all of you is that to really reflect on anti-racism work as effectively breaking barriers. Like if you think about it in any other way, because there's so many pre-existing barriers that we may not notice, and we see it whether it is newcomers seeking employment or having language kind of difficulties, or challenges accessing housing, or cultural taboos around mental health. There's so many barriers, and I think anti-racism work has to be able to work towards eliminating some of those barriers, and also to create equitable systems. And many of us work in the systems, and sometimes it's challenging to change them, because it feels like you're moving the Titanic just to turn a little bit, northeast, which doesn't always feel easy. But doing it with partners and doing it with stakeholders really expands the reach, but also it makes sure that the organization does not lose steam or does not lose that. And I've seen the challenge of doing this work alone, whereby you're lifting heavy weight, and all of us know you lift heavy weights alone, that's going to be much, much harder. But the more you collaborate, it's much easier. And I think I want to leave you with this, that when you think about doing anti-racism work, the focus is always like, oh, but racism is only about individuals. I think that is actually one of the biggest kind of barriers to doing this work, because you always think it's one bad apple versus one bad tomato. And then someone is also tossing tomatoes because they're like, you're not doing it well, you're not doing it greatly. While in reality, this is part of a systems transformation. And I think the federal government is realizing it, that some of the ways, work has been done within government has been problematic, because systems may look invisible, but affect people in so many different ways. And I think that's one of the key things I want to leave with you. And to remember that if you're doing this work, transforming a system happens by everyday interactions. And I find that we often underestimate how meaningful and powerful everyday interactions are. But I have done anti-racism work for maybe 6-7 years. And one of the things that has blown me away has been seeing people who so stereotypical and racist start to really turn around and be like, I never really understood the value of this work. And seeing organizations shift and say, we didn't prioritize it at the time, even when we thought we're doing it right, and to really be able to, to adjust course and to be able to reflect on what they could be doing better. But for many of you, and I know we're getting to the end, like this is something that if you want, we'll take a few questions if you folks can permit us a few more minutes so we can wrap up. But also, because I had one question that came up that I thought we might be able to address, but I also know some of you folks have to go, and we want to respect your time and your participation. And some resources will be shared by the RACER team, after this session. So there'll be recordings of this presentation. There's some resources that we've worked together to create. So again, feel free to get in touch with any of them if you need any extra supports, or if you need any extra information, and even maybe feedback, just to say this was useful, or this could be useful in other ways, or to share the word. And if you need to reach out to me at all, this is my information. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful weekend.